It's September 1st, 2017. This is the RheumNow Week in Review. I'm Jack Cush, executive editor of RheumNow.com. A lot going on in our world. At the top of the news, I think we should talk about the Hurricane Harvey that's hit the south coast of Texas, where I'm from. I was unaffected in Dallas, but many were. I would really strongly urge you to go to the link on the website to donate to the American Red Cross, or if you just want to text the word Harvey to 90999, you'll be donating $10 to the cause, a very worthwhile cause. I also want to remind you to be on the lookout for our ACR 2017 coverage. We've been working hard to change the way we do that, to expand what we do, to really excite you so that you can see what's going on from our viewpoint. That's coming up. It's going to be quite exciting. So at the top of the news, 25 studies have looked at patients who have have rheumatoid arthritis, who are going to get therapy, and it shows that basically there's a very low risk of hepatitis B reactivation when you have a history of chronic or a resolved HBV. Those are patients who are Hep B surface antigen negative and Hep B core antibody positive, suggesting they've seen the virus in the past and have a resolved infection. The chance of reactivation, looking at a large number of studies, is 1.6%, which is really quite encouraging, and it's really not any higher if you take a biologic or specifically a TNF inhibitor. So it seems that you can use a TNF inhibitor in those patients, but you must use it with caution. Our friend and colleague Len Calabrese tweeted that, remember that while Hep B reactivation is really quite rare, it is also preventable. So you still need to worry about these patients, check their LFTs, look at viral loads. If you think that they're really immunosuppressed beyond rheumatoid arthritis, they probably should see a hepatologist and consider background antiviral therapy before going on a biologic agent. A study of geriatric patients, specifically 1,667 geriatric patients who had septic arthritis, were matched 10 to 1, 10 elderly people, and then versus the one who had the septic arthritis, and showed that the chance of death with septic arthritis in the elderly has increased 50 to 100%, suggesting that not only is it a poor candidate to get such infections, but the outcomes are striking. So aggressive treatment is needed there. The New York Times has reported that the FDA is announcing a crackdown on the unscrupulous practices being seen in many stem cell clinics across the United States. We wrote about this before. As you know, there are clinics, mainly orthopedic clinics, but a lot of other disciplines in medicine are getting into this regenerative medicine movement, where they're taking the patient's cells, whether it be from fat, bone, or bone marrow, putting them into culture, repurposing them, tricking them up a little bit, and then injecting them back into the patient to resolve something, calling this stem cell therapy. A lot of these, there have been adverse events and serious adverse events associated with this. The FDA is of the position that in some of these clinics, some of these practices are unscrupulous, some of them are dangerous, and that what they're giving back to patients isn't a blood product, but in fact qualifies as a drug or biologic. So this is going to fall under the scrutiny of the FDA. An uncontrolled study of severe ocular Behçet's showed that when they were treated with TNF inhibitors, only about half of them respond to TNF inhibition. Only half of these stay in remission over time. That's been my experience in using Behçet's. I don't see a lot of ocular severe Behçet's, so in that situation there has been some literature to suggest it may work, but otherwise a lot of Behçet's with mucocutaneous involvement and joint involvement, they don't respond to TNF inhibitor, in my opinion. An analysis of the epidemiology of lupus worldwide shows that really the incidence and prevalence of lupus varies quite a bit worldwide, but overall it seems that the incidence is increasing over time. It seems that there are higher frequencies in African Americans, especially from North America, where the rate of lupus is 23 per 100 patient years. It is lowest in Africa, interesting, in Ukraine and Northern Australia. A study coming from the endocrine world shows that untreated sleep apnea increases diabetes, basically, and the metabolic syndrome. They looked at this in several ways, including taking patients who are on CPAP and taking them off and seeing what happened to certain biologic measures. And they showed that untreated sleep apnea increased free fatty acids, glucose levels, cortisol levels, and blood pressure, which we know about. So again, I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time treating and managing sleep and getting patients to go to get studied for sleep apnea, many of whom are resistant. but it is something that we should initiate as rheumatologists. A lot of regulatory information in this week's news. At the top of the list, maybe the most important, is that the FDA approved its first gene therapy. This is CAR T therapy. It's called Kymera, Kyrmiah, from Novartis, $475,000 a treatment, thank you. And this is being approved for the treatment of young adults under age 20 who have refractory B-cell ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, as you know, has a high mortality rate. If those patients don't respond to conventional therapy, it's estimated about 15–20%. They're giving this CAR T therapy. That's a chimeric antigen receptor that targets that's injected into the patient's cells, a specific gene that does that, and basically causes T cells to go after the target B cells, CD19 B cells specifically, to kill them. It kills normal cells. There's a lot of toxicity or symptom management that goes on with this. There's a strong risk of developing the cytokine release syndrome, and at the same time that the FDA approved this drug, they also approved Actemra, which inhibits IL-6, to manage the cytokine release syndrome with a dramatic reduction in toxicity and severity and time of those events. So 2 drugs being approved at the same time to treat acute ALL. The FDA has also made a turnabout in its decision about baricitinib. As you know, we reported in July that the FDA was rejecting baricitinib's application, citing an imbalance in thromboembolic events in those that were receiving the high dose of baricitinib, where they saw 5 cases and no cases in the low dose 2 milligram or in the placebo patients, in the placebo-controlled portion of the study with 3,000 plus patients. The speculation was that they're going to have to start over. They may have to do studies. This was going to delay the approval of the drug to either 2019 or 2021, depending on who you read. But in negotiations and discussions with the FDA, Lilly and Incyte have announced that they're going to resubmit a new NDA for baricitinib in January of 2018. The FDA will have 6 months to review that data and come back with a decision about baricitinib, which, as you know, is an oral JAK inhibitor that is a once-a-day dosing, is felt to be a big player. This changes the mix. Right now, we only have one JAK inhibitor, tofacitinib. There's filgotinib and upadacitinib, or the one from ABT 494 from AbbVie, and those are in development. We're going to jump ahead of baricitinib. Now they're probably going to be a little bit behind baricitinib if baricitinib goes through the process and can explain that those venous thromboembolic events probably are at a rate that is commensurate with what's seen in RA patients who have an increased risk of venous thromboembolism. Another regulatory action, much to my surprise, I didn't know this was brewing, but another adalimumab biosimilar was approved from Boehringer Ingelheim this week by the FDA. It's called Cyltezo, Cyltexo. Anyway, again, it's not likely that's going to hit the market anytime soon. There's a lot of litigation going on with this and Amgevita, the other adalimumab biosimilar from Amgen, and litigation over patent protection and whatnot. It's going to be a while before we see an adalimumab biosimilar. Certainly not in the next 6 months would be my estimation. Canakinumab was a nice report that we've been waiting for. There's several reports going on in the cardiology literature where they're testing the hypothesis that control of inflammation will control the risk of cardiovascular events. So we have trials going on in methotrexate and Plaquenil, and this study, the CANTO study, with an IL-1 inhibitor, canakinumab. So the results of that were published presented at a meeting in Spain, a cardiology meeting in Spain, and also published on New England Journal, showing that canakinumab given to 10,000 patients who are at high risk for cardiovascular events. They've had a prior MI, they have an elevated high-resolution CRP level greater than 2 milligrams per liter, and they're followed over, I think it was 2 years, and actually it's 3.7 years of follow-up, and they showed that overall, those who received either 150 milligrams or 300 milligrams of canakinumab every 12 weeks had a 15% reduction in cardiovascular events. That was significant, and it was just not only the events, but death from cardiovascular events were also seen. Another offshoot to the study showed that those who were treated with canakinumab also had a lower risk of lung cancer. Both the onset of incident lung cancer and death from lung cancer was lower in patients who were taking, and there the reductions, I believe, were close to 50% reductions. These are all interesting results. The problem is the canakinumab, as priced currently, is over $115,000 a year, and so it's not likely to be used as routine prophylaxis for cardiovascular prevention, nor for cancer prevention. So we need to understand the biology of what's going on here, or find other ways to use IL-1 inhibition to these benefits. This current issue of the arthritis and rheumatology, used to call it arthritis and rheumatism. I don't think that was a good change, but A&R, let's call it, has 3 articles devoted to the topic of shingles vaccination. The first one comes from Kevin Winthrop and Jeff Curtis, who did a study in 112 patients who were going to receive tofacitinib, and they were randomized to receive either live virus vaccine or placebo, and they showed that it was safe to use the live virus vaccine and then wait 2 or 3 weeks and then give tofacitinib with no untoward reactions. The only untoward reaction seen in this trial was one patient who developed disseminated herpes zoster, and that patient had no innate immunity to zoster. They when they checked, this was basically first time exposure for that patient, and so that rare event was seen in this trial. But overall, it looks like that practice of vaccinating before the use of tofacitinib was quite efficacious. And that's currently my practice. Not only do I do this in patients over the age of 60 who are eligible to receive the vaccine, I urge anybody under the age of 60 who needs this drug to get the live virus vaccine as soon as possible, whenever possible. There are 2 other reports. One was just a general review of the large number of studies done with tofacitinib, showing that the rate still is consistent at about 4 zoster events per 100 patient years. Most of these were involving one dermatome and weren't serious, involving the eye and etc. That the rates were higher in certain regions such as Southeast Asia and I think the Ukraine, and then also were higher in patients who took steroids. And then the last one was an editorial that I wrote called Fear the Infection, Value the Solution when it comes to herpes zoster. In it, I review who's at risk, how these patients should be approached, and the practice of vaccinating, which is patients need to be off of biologic therapies for at least 2 weeks and maybe as much as 4 weeks, and then receive the vaccine, and then they can go ahead and get the biologic restarted, the tofacitinib restarted 2 weeks later. So again, be off for, vaccinate, and then restart 2 weeks later is the practice advocated by the CDC and many. Please be sure to check out our new therapeutic updates. The last one we posted was with Phil Meese, Alan Gabowski, and myself commenting on 5 questions on the FDA hearing regarding the use of tofacitinib in psoriatic arthritis, where it seems like that's going to get approved, and it'd be interesting to hear the perspectives of those who are either there or viewed the results and have some perspective by being past FDA members such as Gibo and myself. So that's it for this week at RheumNow.com. I'll leave you with these words of wisdom. The job is not you, nor is your income, car, or good looks. You are your principles, and what you do when those principles are called into question. I dreamed up this little quote. I kind of wrote it, but I wrote it after listening to a podcast by Malcolm Gladwell, who has a podcast called Revisionist History. The link is on the website. The podcast in particular that led to this almost thoughtful quote was about a doctor at the Mayo Clinic who spent his life doing research on diet and the role of a fatty diet in cardiovascular disease, and that many years after his death, the solution, the answer to the question was found in his basement. So the episode is called The Basement Tapes. It is about values and work ethic and about principles. See you next week. This is RheumNow.com.